wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the chill of a storm that had swept across the city. A man stood alone, his eyes scanning the horizon, a sense of disbelief still clinging to him like the cold air. His hands trembled as he gripped the small, worn-out suitcase, the only piece of his life left in his possession. The world seemed to have collapsed in on him all at once, and he couldn't shake the image of her, the stunning alien beauty he had once believed was his partner, the mother of his child. She had left him, and with her, their toddler. He had never expected it to end this way. The love they had shared felt as though it had transcended the differences between their worlds, and for a while he had allowed himself to believe that it was real. But now, standing in the deserted streets, he was forced to face the harsh reality that he had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in her life. A moment she had discarded without a second thought. The memories of their time together, their laughter, the warmth of her touch, now felt like distant echoes from another life, one that no longer existed. What had gone wrong? He replayed their last moments together over and over again in his mind. The way she had looked at him as though he were a stranger, the coldness in her eyes when she said she was leaving. There had been no warning, no explanation, just the sudden, heart-wrenching departure that left him standing there, frozen, as she vanished into the night with their child. Was he just another casualty of the war between her people and his? Or had their love been nothing more than a lie she had cleverly woven around him? It was hard to tell, but the pain of betrayal cut deep, and it hurt more than he had ever imagined it would. His heart ached for his child, the little one who had come into his life as a symbol of hope, a symbol of their shared future. Now, that future seemed impossibly distant, as though it had been ripped away from him in a cruel twist of fate. In the distance, the faint sound of footsteps broke through the silence, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the street, but there was no one in sight. Just the empty, lifeless city, the remnants of a world that had once felt so full of promise. His mind raced as he wondered where she had gone. Was she taking their child to her people? Or had she simply vanished, leaving him in the dust? He couldn't understand how someone he had loved so deeply could just walk away. He thought he had known her better than anyone else, but now he was forced to question everything he had believed about her. Was it all a facade? He had always known that the world they shared was complicated. Their relationship, one between a human and an alien, had never been easy. It was fraught with tension, cultural differences, and the ever-present fear of what the future might hold. But none of that had ever felt like a barrier to him. He had believed in them, believed that love could bridge the divide between their worlds. But now, standing alone in the cold, with nothing but the suitcase in his hand and a heart full of unanswered questions, he wasn't sure he believed in anything anymore. The city around him seemed to mock his pain, its towering buildings casting long shadows over the streets. His mind felt clouded, as if the weight of his thoughts had turned everything around him into a blur. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand why she had done this, why she had left him with nothing but the echoes of their memories and a child who now felt like a distant dream. The sound of footsteps grew louder again, this time coming from behind him. He didn't turn around. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing another reminder of his failure, another face that might remind him of her. But as the footsteps grew closer, a sense of dread washed over him. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just his pain clouding his thoughts. Something else was happening, something he couldn't quite grasp. As the footsteps came to a stop just behind him, the man's heart skipped a beat. He swallowed hard, hoping for a familiar voice, hoping it would be her or perhaps even a stranger who could offer him some solace. But when he turned to face the person, his heart sank into his stomach. It was a woman, but not the one he had been expecting. Her eyes were cold and calculating, and she wore the unmistakable insignia of the alien race that had once been an ally of his. She didn't speak at first, just watched him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. He could see the tension in her posture, the way she seemed to be calculating something. His heart raced as he wondered if she was another enemy sent to finish what the others had started, or if she was simply another reminder of the alien race that had torn his world apart. Finally, she spoke, her voice as cold as her stare. "You're not alone," she said, her words sending a chill down his spine. "She left, but there are others." The man's mind reeled, unable to fully process what she was saying. "What do you mean?" "What others?" The woman took a slow step back, her expression unreadable. "You've been abandoned, but there are those who might not have abandoned you yet." The words hung in the air like a mystery, one that he couldn't quite unravel. His heart pounded in his chest as he wondered what this woman knew, what secrets she was holding. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the distance. Left standing there, the man's mind was filled with more questions than ever before. His life had been turned upside down by the departure of the alien beauty he had loved, but now there was a new mystery to unravel. Who were these others, and what did they want with him? His journey was far from over. The answers were out there, somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, he stood alone, the weight of his past and the uncertainty of the future pressing down on him. And as the storm clouds gathered overhead, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had a much larger role to play in his life than he had ever realized. The woman's footsteps faded, and the man was left standing in the middle of the empty street, the words she had spoken lingering in the air like a riddle that he couldn't quite solve. Others. What did that even mean? He felt a surge of confusion and anger, but it quickly dissipated into a hollow emptiness. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't sure what to do next. The world around him seemed distant and unreal, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He glanced down at the suitcase in his hand, the weight of it pulling him back to the reality he had been forced into. He couldn't understand how it had all come to this. Just a few days ago, he had been a man with a family. Now, he was standing alone, abandoned, not just by the woman he loved, but also by the life he had once known. His mind kept drifting back to her, the alien woman who had appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. She had been everything to him, someone who had made him believe in something more than just survival, someone who had made him feel alive. But now, it felt as though she had never really been a part of his world. Her departure had been swift, leaving him with a child and a shattered heart. But more than that, it had left him with a question that gnawed at him relentlessly. Why? Why had she left? What had happened to the connection they had shared? The city around him was quiet, almost eerily so. It had once been a bustling hub of activity, a place where people lived, loved, and worked. But now, it felt like a shell of its former self. He couldn't even remember when the lights had gone out, or when the sounds of life had stopped echoing through the streets. It was as if everything had simply stopped moving when she had left. He walked down the deserted streets, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. He passed buildings that seemed to watch him, their dark windows like empty eyes. What was he supposed to do now? The thought of going back to the place they had shared, the apartment that now felt more like a tomb than a home, made his chest tighten with pain. He couldn't face it. The memories of her were too fresh, too raw. He didn't want to relive them in the place where everything had started to unravel. He glanced down at the suitcase once more. It held all the physical remnants of his life, all the things that had once meant something. But now it felt empty. He didn't need the clothes or the personal items packed inside. What he needed were answers, closure. His mind raced with possibilities. Was she gone for good, or was there a chance he could find her? Was she hiding somewhere, waiting for him to come to her, or had she truly moved on? His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a vehicle approaching. The low rumble of an engine broke the silence, and he instinctively turned to face it. A sleek, black hover car appeared around the corner, gliding smoothly toward him. It slowed as it drew near, and the window rolled down to reveal a figure in a dark cloak. The man didn't recognize the face, but there was something about the way the figure looked at him that made his heart skip a beat. "Need a lift?" the figure asked, the voice smooth and unruffled. There was something oddly familiar about it, though he couldn't place it. The man hesitated, unsure of what to make of this new stranger. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice low, guarded. The figure didn't respond right away, and for a moment they simply stared at each other in silence. The man could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze, as though they were measuring him, evaluating him. It made him feel uncomfortable, but also oddly compelled to trust them. "I can help you," the stranger finally said. "But first, you need to understand something. You're not alone in this." The man raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to make of the statement. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone cautious. The figure's eyes flickered, as though considering how much to reveal. "The woman you loved, she isn't just a rogue. She isn't just someone who abandoned you without reason." The stranger paused, letting the words sink in. "She has a past, a mission. You were part of it, whether you realize it or not." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to think that there had been a purpose to her actions other than betrayal. But deep down, he knew the truth. There had always been something off about her, something that didn't quite fit. Their love had felt too perfect, too magical. And now, standing in front of this stranger, he realized that perhaps he had never truly known her at all. "What mission?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something that could have been pity. "That's not for me to say, but I can show you the way. If you want to find her, I can help you." The figure paused for a moment, as though weighing the situation. "But be warned, you're not the only one looking for her." The man's heart raced at the mention of others. Who else was searching for her? And why? He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much larger than he had ever imagined. Without a second thought, he grabbed the handle of the hovercar and climbed in. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss, sealing him in with the stranger who seemed to hold all the answers he desperately sought. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly through the empty streets, and the man couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Where would this journey lead? He didn't know, but one thing was certain: the truth was out there. As they disappeared into the city's shadows, the man's mind raced with questions. What had he gotten himself into? And what had the woman been a part of all along? The vehicle sped through the empty streets, its hover engines humming softly as the man sat in tense silence beside the cloaked figure. The city outside the window felt like an abandoned dream, its towering structures standing like silent sentinels in the night. The eerie stillness around them only heightened the unease gnawing at the man's gut. He couldn't help but wonder if he was making a mistake by following this stranger. Yet, the pull to find answers, to understand what had happened to the woman he had loved, was too strong to ignore. The figure beside him remained silent, their face obscured by the hood, leaving him with nothing but the sound of their steady breathing and the occasional hum of the vehicle's engines. The man couldn't read them, couldn't figure out if they were an ally or just another piece in this complex puzzle. But there was something about their presence that seemed to hold a deep knowledge, a quiet assurance that perhaps, just perhaps, they could help him understand the chaos his life had become. As the minutes ticked by, the cityscape blurred in the windows, giving way to darker, less familiar territory. The air seemed heavier now, thick with anticipation, and the man's thoughts raced. What was he walking into? Who else was looking for her? And why had the woman left him with so many unanswered questions? He thought back to the moment she had disappeared, how her eyes had met his one last time, filled with an emotion he couldn't decipher. Had she been running from something, or had she been running towards something? A sudden jolt shook the hovercar, snapping him out of his reverie. The vehicle's smooth glide faltered for a moment before it stabilized, and the stranger finally spoke, their voice breaking the long silence. "We're close. Stay alert." The man's heart skipped a beat. "Close to what?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. The stranger's face remained hidden, but the tone of their voice carried a weight, as though they were preparing him for something big, something dangerous. "Close to the truth." The words hung in the air like a veil, heavy and ominous. He could feel the tension building inside him, like a storm waiting to break. Every fiber of his being screamed that he was on the brink of something monumental, something that could either give him the closure he so desperately craved or shatter what little remained of his world. The vehicle slowed as they approached a large, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The structure was imposing, its broken windows and crumbling walls giving it an air of neglect and secrecy. It was the kind of place you would never venture into without a reason. The kind of place that whispered danger in the darkness. And yet, here they were, heading straight toward it. The hovercar came to a stop just outside the entrance, its engines powering down with a soft hum. The man's chest tightened as he stared at the darkened doorway, his pulse quickening with a mixture of dread and anticipation. This was it, the moment of truth. But as much as he had yearned for this, yearned for answers, he couldn't shake the feeling that stepping into that building would change everything. The stranger's eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time, there was a hint of something vulnerable in their gaze. "Remember," they said softly, "what you find in there might not be what you expect. You've come this far, but once you step inside, there's no turning back." The man nodded, though his mind was a whirlwind of uncertainty. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let fear control him any longer. The woman had left him with a child and a shattered life, but she had also left him with a purpose. He had to see this through. He had to understand what had happened. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle. The cool night air hit him like a slap, and he instinctively pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. Every step he took toward it felt like an eternity, each footfall echoing in the silence. They reached the entrance, and the stranger pushed open the heavy door with ease. It creaked ominously, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the dim light from a single flickering bulb cast long, eerie shadows across the room. The place felt abandoned, but the man's instincts told him that it was anything but. He followed the stranger deeper into the building, his footsteps soft but deliberate. The hallway stretched out before them, its walls lined with old, faded posters that hinted at a time long gone. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that clung to you like a second skin, making every sound feel magnified. He could hear his own breathing, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally, they came to a large room at the end of the hallway, and the stranger stopped in front of a metal door. It was unlike any door he had seen before, reinforced, with strange markings etched into its surface. His mind raced with questions, but before he could ask, the stranger turned to him, their expression unreadable. "This is it," they said quietly. "Whatever you find in here will change everything. But you need to be ready." The man's throat went dry as he nodded. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. With a deep breath, he stepped forward and reached for the door. As his hand made contact with the cold metal, the door groaned and slowly began to open. The air inside was musty, the smell of old machinery and forgotten secrets hanging heavy in the room. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw them. At the center of the room, there was a small, circular table, and on it, a device alien in design, yet strangely familiar. It pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow, casting an otherworldly light across the room. But what caught his attention more than the device was the figure standing beside it. She was there. His heart stopped as he recognized the other figure beside her. It was a child, small, no older than a toddler, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. The woman's eyes met his, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The intensity of the moment hit him like a wave, and his breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. But nothing could have prepared him for the truth he was about to uncover. The moment his eyes locked onto the woman, everything around him seemed to blur. She stood there, her expression a mixture of confusion and recognition, yet there was something else, something darker. His heart pounded in his chest as his gaze flicked from her to the child at her side, the small figure standing so still, its glowing eyes watching him with an unsettling calm. It was his child, but so much had changed, so much had been hidden. His mind scrambled to process the moment, but he couldn't find the words. "Why?" he managed to croak, his voice hoarse. The question hung in the air between them, fragile, desperate. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. His child shifted slightly, as if sensing the tension in the room. The woman's gaze flickered briefly to the device on the table, the glowing artifact pulsing faintly in sync with her heartbeat. Then, with a soft exhale, she spoke. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to mask it with a steady tone. "I never wanted this to happen." His mind raced. Not what he thought. What had he been thinking? That she'd left him out of selfishness, perhaps to run off into the night with someone else? Or that she had been hiding the truth from him all along? But this wasn't what he had expected. "You abandoned me," he said, the bitterness in his words sharp. "You left me with nothing but questions. And now you expect me to believe you?" She shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached out, as if trying to bridge the distance between them. "I had no choice. You wouldn't understand, but you have to trust me now." What's happening is bigger than us, bigger than anything we've known. His anger flared, but there was also confusion, doubt. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the sight of their child, made his throat tighten. There was something in that child's eyes that he couldn't ignore. They weren't just innocent, wide eyes of a toddler. No, there was something ancient in them, something far beyond his understanding. "You've changed," he said, his voice lower now, quieter. He couldn't look away from her. "What are you involved in?" Before she could answer, a sound broke the silence, a low hum that began to echo through the room. It wasn't the device. It was something else, something deeper. The woman's face paled, her eyes widening in fear. "They're here," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man's heart raced. "Who's here?" he demanded, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get out of this place before something worse happened. But it was too late. The walls of the room seemed to shift as the air grew colder, thicker with an unseen pressure. The humming grew louder, vibrating through his chest until it was impossible to ignore. He tried to move, to act, but his body felt heavy, trapped. Then the door to the room slammed shut with a force that shook the building. He whipped around, his pulse quickening, only to see a group of figures stepping from the shadows. Their movements were deliberate, too perfect, too synchronized to be human. They were tall, their features obscured by dark cloaks that seemed to ripple in the dim light. As they entered the room, a faint red glow filled the space, casting everything in an eerie, unnatural hue. "Who are they?" he demanded, stepping between the woman and the child instinctively, his mind racing. "What do they want?" The woman looked at him, her expression filled with sorrow. "They are the reason I had to leave you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been watching us, watching me. They don't want the child. They want something else. Something else." His voice grew more frantic, the weight of the situation settling in. "What do they want?" Before she could respond, one of the figures stepped forward, its voice echoing in a language he didn't recognize. It wasn't a language he'd ever heard before. Alien, guttural, its very tone filled with a chilling authority. The words felt like ice against his skin, sending a shiver down his spine. The woman's body stiffened, her face going pale. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the figures, her voice quivering as she spoke in the same language, her words coming quickly, urgently. The man watched, his mind spinning as the conversation unfolded before him. He could feel the weight of the tension, thick and suffocating, yet he couldn't make sense of any of it. The woman had been hiding something, that much was clear, but now it was beyond just a betrayal. She was part of something far larger, something dangerous, and he was trapped in the middle of it. Then, as if to confirm his worst fears, one of the cloaked figures turned toward him, its hidden eyes locking onto his with an unnerving intensity. The air around him seemed to freeze. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. A deep, resonating voice filled the room, the words spoken in a language he could barely comprehend, but that his body instinctively reacted to. The figure gestured toward him, and before he could even take a step, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him forward, an invisible force tugging at his very core. His body froze, unable to move, and his heart pounded in his chest, knowing something terrible was coming, but not understanding what. "Don't!" The woman's voice cracked as she shouted, but the figure's hand moved, and with a single motion, the force on him intensified. His vision blurred, his head spinning, and just as he felt himself about to collapse under the weight of it, The sound of the child's voice pierced the air. It was a single word spoken softly, but with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. The figures faltered, their movements stilled for a brief moment, and in that instant the man found his bearings. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his body heavy but free from the grip of the unseen force. The woman rushed to him, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," she pleaded. "The child. They want the child. But it's not what you think. We're not safe here." But before she could explain further, the figures turned, their attention shifting once more. The man's mind raced as he struggled to stand, but it was clear now whatever had been set into motion wasn't over. The child was the key. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined, and the truth was even more dangerous than he had feared. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the figures, their cloaked forms looming like shadows, advanced toward the child. His heart raced in his chest, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The woman's voice trembled as she spoke, trying to explain, to beg them for mercy, but it felt like a futile effort. The cloaked figures didn't seem to care for explanations. Their focus was singular, and that focus was on the child. But just as they reached for the child, a loud crack echoed through the room, like the sound of glass shattering. The air trembled, as if reality itself had fractured. For a split second, the figures paused, looking around, unsure of the sudden disturbance. The child, her tiny hands raised, released an almost imperceptible hum from deep within her chest, a sound so quiet, so subtle, yet so powerful that it reverberated through the very walls of the room. The cloaked figures flinched, stepping back in unison, their faces hidden behind their hoods. The woman gasped. "It's begun," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man stared at her, his mind racing. "What do you mean, it's begun?" he demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. She didn't answer him right away. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the child, who, despite her age, was exuding an energy the man couldn't comprehend. He had never seen anything like it before. It was raw power, something ancient, something unyielding, and it was pouring from his child like a flood. "She's not just a child," the woman said, her voice trembling now. "She's a conduit, a bridge, between our worlds and theirs." The man's mind struggled to grasp her words. "What do you mean? What is she?" he asked again, panic rising in his chest. But before the woman could respond, the figures reacted, their hands suddenly reaching for the child with swift, deliberate motions. There was no hesitation, no mercy in their actions. The man moved instinctively, stepping forward to shield the child, but as his hand reached out to pull her back, a searing pain shot through his body. It was like 1,000 needles piercing his skin, sending him sprawling to the floor, gasping for air. "You cannot stop this," the leader of the cloaked figures said, its voice cold and detached. "She belongs to them now." "No," the woman cried out, her eyes wide with horror. She rushed forward, her hands outstretched toward the child, but she stopped short, her body frozen in place as if something invisible was holding her back. The room began to pulse, the walls flickering in and out of focus, as if reality itself was bending. The energy coming from the child intensified, a low hum growing louder with every passing second. The man's head throbbed, the pressure in his temples unbearable as the world around him began to shake. The figures were backing away now, their expressions unreadable under their cloaks, but it was clear that whatever power the child was channeling, it was not something they could control. Something shifted in the room, the very air growing heavy. charged with an electrical tension that seemed to cling to every surface. And then, in an instant, it stopped. The hum died down, and the room returned to stillness. The figures froze in place, their once commanding presence now diminished. The woman, still standing, stared at her child, her face pale and drained of color. The man, still struggling to catch his breath on the floor, watched in stunned silence. "What just happened?" he whispered hoarsely. The woman slowly turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "She's done it," she said quietly. "She sealed the bond." For a moment, the man could only stare at her. "What bond?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you mean?" But as the woman opened her mouth to speak, another figure entered the room, one he hadn't noticed before, standing in the far corner, watching silently as everything unfolded. It was taller than the others, its presence more imposing. It stepped forward, its form slowly becoming clearer as the shadows receded, revealing a face the man had only seen once, years ago, before everything had gone wrong. It was her, the woman he thought he had lost forever. But now she was different. Her eyes, once full of warmth, were now cold, calculating. Her body was no longer the soft, familiar one he had held in his arms, but something else, something strange and otherworldly. Her movements were too precise, too perfect, as if she were no longer entirely human. She didn't speak at first, simply observing the man and the woman with an unreadable expression. And then, when she finally spoke, her voice was like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "You should have known," she said, her tone filled with bitterness. "All of this was inevitable. You never understood who she was, what she could do." The man's mind reeled. The woman he had once known, the one who had loved him, now stood before him. But it was the child that had his attention. He looked down at her, his heart pounding in his chest. And in that moment, as the room pulsed with energy, everything clicked into place. The child wasn't just their daughter. She was something more, something that bridged the gap between worlds, between realities. She had the power to reshape everything, to either destroy or save them all. The woman, the alien woman, her once human face now twisted in a cruel smirk, stepped closer, her eyes glowing faintly. "It's over," she whispered, her voice cold. "The child is mine now." But as she reached for the child, the man acted on pure instinct, pulling the girl away from her. In that instant, everything exploded. The force of the energy was like nothing he had ever felt, uncontrollable, violent, and all-encompassing. The walls cracked, the ceiling shattered, and for a moment the world seemed to break apart. When the dust finally settled, the man found himself lying on the ground, his body aching, his vision blurry. But as he opened his eyes, he saw her, his child, standing there, glowing with an otherworldly light. The air around her shimmered, and in her gaze, he saw something that terrified him, the power to change everything, to rewrite history itself. And then, with a single glance at the figures who had once threatened them, she spoke. Her voice, though small, carried the weight of the universe. "You've lost." The figures froze. The woman, her mother, stared at her in disbelief, her face contorting in a mixture of rage and fear. But it was too late. Child, with a flick of her hand, dissolved the threat. The cloaked figures, the ones who had sought to control her, disintegrated into nothingness, their forms vanishing like mist in the wind. For the first time, the room was quiet. The child was no longer just a symbol of their past. She was the key to their future, the force that would determine the fate of everything. And as the man held her in his arms, the reality of the situation hit him. He had been a part of something far bigger than himself. And now, as he looked at her, he realized that their journey had only just begun. The world would never be the same again. The silence hung between them, almost as if the world itself had paused to witness the storm that had passed. The alien beauty stood there, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had made the hardest decision of her life, the one that tore her from everything she had known, from the bond she once thought could never be broken. And yet, standing before him now, she realized just how much she had underestimated the consequences. The man she had once loved, the father of their child, now stood across from her, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. For a long moment, no one spoke. The toddler clung to his side, sensing the shift in the air, but unable to grasp the complexity of what was unfolding. She looked at the child, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sorrow. She had left them both. She had left her family, driven by forces she thought were beyond her control. She had thought she was doing the right thing, but now, as she stood face to face with the consequences, everything felt wrong. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, raw and unfiltered. How could she just leave? How could she abandon the life they had built, the love they had shared? How could she walk away from their child, their future? She swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. There were so many things she wanted to say, so many things that had kept her awake at night. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but she wasn't sure where to begin. She wasn't sure how to make him see the truth, that she had never stopped loving him, that her departure was never about him. It had been about the forces she had no control over, about the decisions made for her by her people. But even as she opened her mouth to speak, she realized the truth. No words could fix this. No explanation could undo the hurt. The damage had been done, and now all that was left was the question of what came next. The silence between them stretched on, but this time it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of tension. It was the silence of a realization, the space where understanding could begin to bloom. He turned his gaze to their child, who was still holding onto his side, clinging to the only stability they had left. The child's innocent face, so full of wonder and trust, broke through the anger and hurt in his heart. For all the pain, for all the confusion, there was still a future to consider. There was still the child they had both loved, the bond they had both sworn to protect. "Maybe we can try to rebuild," he said softly, more to himself than to her. His voice was steady now, the anger subsiding into something quieter, something more resigned. "But it can't just be you and me. It's about our child. It's about them." The alien woman nodded slowly, her heart heavy with guilt. "I know," she whispered. "I know. I never wanted this for them. I never wanted to hurt either of you." She took a tentative step forward, reaching out to touch his arm, but she hesitated. She didn't know if he would allow her the touch, or if it would just remind him of all the reasons they were no longer a family. The man didn't pull away. Instead, he gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that despite everything, there was still something left. The connection between them wasn't gone. It was just buried under layers of hurt and misunderstanding. Maybe, with time, it could be rebuilt. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We both did. But that doesn't mean we can't find our way back. It doesn't mean we can't give our child the life they deserve. The alien woman took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'll stay, if you'll have me. I'll stay for them. For all of us." And just like that, the first step toward healing had been taken. It wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. But it was a start. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met. The world had changed them, broken them in ways they hadn't imagined. But they were still standing together, still choosing to fight for what they had left. As they turned to walk back inside, hand in hand, their child between them, they knew that the road ahead would be difficult. They knew that healing would take time, that the scars of the past couldn't be erased overnight. But they also knew that they were no longer alone in this journey. For the first time in a long time, they were choosing to face the future together as a family. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As they stepped inside, the door closing behind them, the weight of the world on their shoulders felt a little lighter. The child, looking up at them with a smile, seemed to know that everything would be okay, that the love they had once shared was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. It wasn't the ending they had imagined, but it was a new beginning, a beginning that held the promise of a future where they could rebuild what had been lost, where they could start over, stronger than before. And as they looked at each other, the promise of a brighter tomorrow seemed just within reach.